Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Welcome back to the podcast. Today I have a very special episode in which I'm interviewing Dr. Eric Helms on programming for hypertrophy, which is the process through which humans build muscle mass. Dr. Helms, Eric, is the Chief Science Officer at 3D Muscle Journey, an online coaching company for strength and physique athletes. He's also a science communicator, helping lifters find sustainable pathways to high performance. He's a research fellow at the Sports Performance Research Institute New Zealand at Auckland University of Technology. He has a bachelor's in sports management, fitness and wellness, a master's with a research focus on protein and macronutrient manipulation for dieting bodybuilders, a second master's in exercise science and health promotion, and a PhD in strength and conditioning with a research focus on auto-regulating powerlifting. He dabbles in weightlifting. He's a raw powerlifter in the IPF, and he earned pro status as a natural bodybuilder with the PNBA in 2011. He isn't only extremely knowledgeable, in case this long list of accolades didn't make it obvious already, he's also extremely passionate about lifting. So I believe that this interview will be incredibly valuable. We started our conversation with an exploration of how hypertrophy actually occurs in humans, and then we transitioned from the science into extremely practical applications to teach you how to write your own hypertrophy programs. We talked about volume, intensity, and frequency, about which exercises are the best for muscle growth, and are there best exercises for muscle growth at all. We talked about exercise variety and exercise variation, and how to put all of these variables together into a program that's effective at promoting muscle growth. This is going to be an incredibly educational conversation. It's steeped in science, but it has loads of practical takeaways. So I hope that you enjoy. Eric, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast today. You're my very first expert guest, and I'm super excited to have you here to talk about hypertrophy. So, first of all, tell the audience who you are, what you do, and what makes you great at what you do.
Nick, well, I appreciate you having me on, and it's an honor to be the first expert interview on your podcast. Hopefully, I can live up to that title. I think to put it simply, I'm essentially just somebody who loves lifting weights and then just took that to the kind of the nth degree with my own curiosity and interest into the science behind it. So I'm an educator, I'm an athlete, and I'm also a coach. Probably most pertinent to the discussion we're going to have today is that I started my academic career looking into basically bodybuilding and strength sport back in when I got out of the Air Force in like 2006. I started my undergrad and then continued, and eventually I found myself where I've been living now for a decade with my wife in Auckland, New Zealand. And I'm a research fellow at the Auckland University of Technology. Specifically, I'm a research fellow in two research groups, strength and conditioning, as well as sports physiology and nutrition. And my focus, essentially, when I describe it to people, is I'm a sports scientist for physique and strength sport. So I did my PhD and my second master's here at AUT. That's what brought me out to New Zealand, because it's a really cool applied university that focuses on um, translational research, the last step before you're telling practitioners what to do, or giving, rather, I should say, advice to practitioners. And I did my PhD specifically on autoregulation tools for powerlifting, and I did a master's specifically on manipulating macronutrients for like muscle retention, strength retention, and dieting strength and physique athletes. Um, so yeah, I've actually spent more than 10 years in school, which is wild. And and then when I figured I got out, I'd be like, well, let me just hang around the school. So I'm a kind of a perennial learner, I guess you could say. And my current role is that's actually a minor part of what I do. Primarily, what I do is I'm a science communicator, if you will, um, like Bill Nye, the muscle guy, I guess. And I'm I have monthly applications in strength sport where we review research on a monthly basis. I have my books, um, and then for 3D Muscle Journey, which is kind of the core of what I do, we try to support the drug-free lifting community. It's my job as what I call the chief science officer, because I'm a science nerd and a Star Trek nerd, to give information to the other coaches to make sure that we're helping our athletes in the best way we can. So that's me, and I also compete pretty regularly. I've done double-digit numbers of both physique sport and strength sport competitions. So yeah, I'm still in the trenches and love it just as much as I always have.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. That's exactly why I wanted to have you here on the podcast, because you have so much experience as an athlete, as a researcher, and also as a coach. And I really like, particularly, I've heard you say it several times on several podcasts, that you are a science communicator. And I also think that the way you distill science into easier to understand information for people who might not be involved in that field is really valuable. So today, what I would like to talk about is essentially how to design a training program for muscle growth. And I thought that first and foremost, we could start with how muscle growth actually happens in humans.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, first let me just say thank you for saying that. And it means I'm doing something right. And yeah, so it's kind of a cool topic just to figure out like the underlying aspects of how do we grow muscle, because a lot of a lot of science is when you really get into it, you realize we're playing connect the dots a lot more than people expect. You think if we're making recommendations about lifting weights and these things that are not they don't need to be done in a lab, right? That surely we have all the specific nuances of the molecular mechanisms underlying it figured out, and that is still an ongoing process. There are still review papers being published in 2022 that are looking at which mechanisms and which theories are holding up for how we think hypertrophy operates, and that's despite the fact that people have been lifting weights for centuries. So I think that's really interesting. That said, at a certain high enough level, we do have a basic understanding of how muscle growth occurs in humans, and this is like after puberty, after you are done with maturation, additional muscle growth comes through what we call mechanotransduction, which is just essentially turning mechanical forces into signals in the body. So when we lift weights, there is actually, there's of course, actin binds to myosin. There's the actual contraction process, and then when those tension levels are high enough, when there's enough cross bridges at a high enough level, there is a signaling cascade that occurs in the muscle, which tells it, hey, we need to make some changes here. Involves a lot of different things, and we're still trying to understand exactly what that process looks like. But once those signals have been initiated, we start to see hypertrophy. And hypertrophy is essentially fibers getting larger. Instead of the addition of a bunch of new fibers, which may happen to a limited extent, but it's difficult to study because you actually have to cut people up, and that's typically not advised by ethics boards.
I suppose it's a bit frowned upon.
It's typically not a good idea to kill people in your research to understand how things are working. That's might have even been why we created ethics boards in the first place, is to prevent that from happening. But nonetheless, that's describing hyperplasia, when you get actually new muscle cells rather than the individual muscle cells getting larger. So we think the largest extent of muscle growth comes from hypertrophy. Um, and the interesting thing about muscle cells or muscle fibers is that they're multinucleated. So unlike
Hmm.
many other cells that have a single nucleus, we have a lot of different nuclei. And one of the things that comes in the later stages of hypertrophy, the initial stages, you get to see a certain amount of muscle growth, and that's fine and dandy. It occurs without much of a barrier, if you will. But as we're understanding what are some of the limits of hypertrophy, there's a theory called myonuclear domain theory. And importantly, it's still debated as to whether this is the way things work. But it seems to be at least a portion of the way things work. The
Hmm.
idea is that there's only so much area of a muscle that can be governed by a single nuclei. So you gain more nuclei from getting satellite cells, which are surrounding, like basically baby nuclei that can become nuclei in the muscle cell. And then those allow governance, if you will, or basically the control and the ability to get all the things that cell needs to live in that area from all these different nuclei. So it starts with the initial increase in fiber diameter. Then the subsequent processes require additional nuclei addition. That sounded weird. Two different words, the word addition, but you know what I'm saying. And then those nuclei allow further muscle growth to occur because they can, govern an extended domain.
Hmm.
Now, the actual signals that allow that whole process, so that's what hypertrophy is. Um, and we can measure that at multiple different levels. At the gross level, it's simply us looking at changes in, say, muscle thickness on an ultrasound, or cross-sectional area on an MRI, or total lean body mass on a DEXA scanner, for example. Um, if we want to measure that on a lower level, we can actually do biopsies, and we can look at individual fiber hypertrophy. What was the diameter of those fibers beforehand? How much did they grow? What was their cross-sectional area? And if we want to look at some of the signals for that, at the gross level, we can look at what's called muscle protein synthesis, which is, so for example, you would use a phenylalanine tracer, which is just a specific amino acid that we've put a radioisotopic label on, and we can see where that radioisotope is going post training and after you take whey protein. And then we can measure, for example, your baseline MPS, muscle protein synthesis, and how that changes over time. And we understand that on a theoretical level, when MPS is higher than MPB, muscle protein breakdown, that should result in net muscle protein accretion. But it doesn't tell us the specifics about it. So we have all these different measurements, and I'm not going to exhaust them all. I just wanted to give some
Hmm.
examples of measuring fiber growth at different levels or muscle growth at different levels, and then some of the signals that should be there. And then we can also look at cross relate that to some of our animal models, where we can do things that wouldn't be considered ethical with humans. And I'm not sure I consider them ethical with animals, but nonetheless, they have been done and are continuing to be done. And things in petri dishes where we try to isolate specific pathways. Now, that's not my expertise. Like I said, I'm a translational researcher, but you need to understand the basics of, how do we come to these things? And we're still trying to figure out, to go full circle, what are some of the initiating factors here? And Brad Schoenfeld wrote a paper back in 2010 where he kind of said, under three broad umbrellas, there are signals and pathways and things that seem to be related to primarily uh, mechanical tension, progressive overload, if you will, progressive tension overload. And then there are potential metabolic stressors, and then there are potential muscle damage stressors that seem secondary to progressive tension overload. And interestingly enough, in the 12 years since that paper was published, there's been a lot of debate around whether or not those latter two are actually true sensors or additive for hypertrophy, or whether they just seem to be these unavoidable things that correlate with the way we train. It's very difficult to do mechanical work in living tissue and not create metabolic stress, because that's how we do work, right?
Yeah.
And also not create muscle damage. And so interestingly enough, despite all this work we've been doing, the jury is relatively still out on those two topics.
Hmm.
It's challenging to consistently isolate a specific metabolite and show that it has a enhancing effect on muscle growth. It might be in some way, it's certainly not additive, meaning like, okay, if we take mechanical tension and we drop some lactate on there or whatever metabolite you're interested in, and boom, more muscle growth. Um, that has not been consistently shown. Likewise, if you do the same thing where you try to replicate similar levels of stress to the muscle, but one induces damage, the other one doesn't, you don't see this kind of, more muscle damage, more muscle growth. So if there is a relationship, and I'm not saying there's not, there could be, it seemed to be maybe permissive or conditional in some way. But for the most part, we're pretty damn sure if you lift weights and you make it harder over time, you'll get bigger. So that was the big takeaway with all that nonsense that I just said.
Well, it wasn't really nonsense to me. It was all very interesting. And what I'm hearing basically is that there's a lot less that we know about muscle hypertrophy than maybe people would expect, considering that we usually take science to be the pinnacle of knowledge. But what we do know is that potentially the primary mechanism might be mechanical tension, so as you call it, progressive tension overload, and maybe metabolic stress and muscle damage could play a role. And if there is a role, you think that it is primarily permissive, so they enable muscle hypertrophy to happen, but they might not be the primary causes. Would that be correct?
It's an excellent summary. I feel like I should have just said that.
Well, I was listening then. So then, if what we need, what seems to be the primary way that we can cause hypertrophy is mechanical tension, so progressive tension overload, does that mean that we can just do anything in the gym, and as long as we make it harder over time, we're going to see muscle growth? Or can we actually make certain modifications to the program that we want to follow to make it more effective to primarily obtain muscle growth as opposed to another fitness adaptation?
Absolutely. So that is a great question, and that's where as soon as we kind of start looking at the practical aspects of things, and we realize that this kind of isolated understanding of how muscle growth occurs interacts with all of our environments and our psychology, and we think about kind of the biopsychosocial model, if you will, then we get to have a lot more fun, and we can think about what levers do we pull at what times, for who, when, and when do we maybe not pull that lever. Um, so now we can start looking at some of the bigger picture variables, like, okay, well, what's the way that we induce, progressive tension overload? Well, we would need to have some way of loading resistance on the body, so we should probably lift some weights. And all right, well, unfortunately, when I lift weights, I don't just grow muscle. A lot of other stuff happens, so I get better at buffering. I might actually get stronger and get better at the actual motor patterns through neuromuscular adaptations. And now I can't just lift that 20-pound weight. I have to lift a 25-pound weight. Um, and maybe, or I don't have a 25-pound weight. I have to do more reps. So all of a sudden, boom, we have this explosion of options. And when we think about organizing them into principles to make the whole process something that we can actually wrap our heads around and create a systematic approach to it, now we have, like, modern resistance training. We have sets and reps. We have volume. We have intensity. We have proximity to failure. We have different repetition ranges and rest periods and quote unquote advanced techniques or intensity techniques, if you like. And there's really just so much on the table that it can be quite overwhelming to an individual. So I like to kind of start from like the top down, if you will, and think about what are the big picture principles. And generally, I think it's useful to talk about volume, intensity, and frequency. So volume is the total amount of work you're doing. Intensity or load or effort, because it just kind of two different types of quote unquote intensity. There's how close are you to failure, which we can call effort. And then there's the actual load on the bar or the weight stack or the dumbbell. And you can express that relative to, say, the most you could do. So in a given exercise, if you have your 1 rep max, the most you could lift for 1 rep, which you don't want to test, of course, on certain exercises. Don't try to figure out your bicep curl 1 rep max. But you have some theoretical maximum amount of force you can produce on any given exercise, and we can use a certain rep range or an RM or a 1 rep max or what have you to figure out, well, how heavy compared to that do we want to lift? And then finally, we also have our frequency, which in the context of trying to get stronger and bigger, we can think of as the frequency that we expose ourselves to a given movement that we're trying to get better at, or other movements that are similar enough to it that are hopefully going to translate to the improving that movement performance, so for strength, and then the frequency of training a given muscle group if we're trying to hypertrophy it. So in that context, now we can do kind of cool research. Even though we don't really know exactly how hypertrophy works, we can go, all right, well, I'm going to take a bunch of people and I'm going to measure them in some of those ways we talked about. And we're going to give them different iterations of volume, intensity, and frequency manipulation. And we're going to look at what happens after 8 weeks once we control all other variables. And then we're going to say, hey, at the group level, it seems like this is better, or this is better, or this is better. And then, unfortunately, since in sports science we're not well funded and most people don't care about this stuff, I don't know why, but I do think the biggest problem facing the world today is we're not jacked enough.
Yeah, I agree.
They're good. That's right. So we're on the same page. So in these cases, we unfortunately have like studies of like 20 people. So then what we have to do is wait a few years, and then those get meta-analyzed together. And in our field, especially in sports science and sports nutrition, et cetera, we often rely on meta-analyses, which are the collection of a lot of these relatively small sample size controlled trials so that we can make broader sweeping conclusions with a much more representative sample size compared to the population we're trying to inform.
Mhm.
So you get 10 studies with 20 people. Hey, we got 200 people. Now we have a reasonable idea of how things operate. So when you kind of do a survey of all the meta-analyses on this topic, you can get an idea of, well, what's a reasonable number of sets for me to start with? What kind of load should I be lifting with? What rep ranges? How long should I rest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we start to land upon some of the principles that I outlined in my books, for example, where, hey, you probably want to be starting around 10-ish sets if you're a novice per muscle group if your goal is hypertrophy. You probably want to be lifting in a rep range where you're doing enough reps per set or there's enough time to induce a stimulus. So it's not so heavy that the set doesn't last very long, but it's not so light that it's more akin to cardio. So maybe we want to train for the most of the time in, like, say, the 5 to 6 to 20 rep range. And then as far as frequency, well, we need to think about how we're going to distribute that volume. So do I want to do 10 sets per muscle group in one workout? Well, I've noticed my quality really goes down, and I start to induce a lot of fatigue locally for that, and my performance is not as good as it possibly could be. So maybe I want to train that at least twice per week, and I could split it up into more frequent or less frequent based upon my personal preference, my schedule, my time availability per session. And that's kind of like where we get to. That's our first step when we take all of this information, is to kind of create some general principles with the understanding that, unfortunately, because we have these bell curve distributions of what is quote unquote normal, is there's a ton of people who hang out 1, 2, 3 standard deviations from the mean. So that means when I tell someone that they need to be doing, let's say start with 10 sets, for some people that's going to be far less than they might end up landing on with self-experimentation, and for others it might be a good bit more. And we have data on that as well. So I always like to include this, not always. I think it's a good idea to include this statement whenever I make these general recommendations, is that your mileage may vary. Like, just as a real quick example, there was a study, I believe, by Demas that came out in 2019, where they looked at either comparing 15 sets per muscle group or 6 to 9. This is kind of a secondary analysis of another. That's why it was 6 or 9, because they manipulated frequency as well. So it's a somewhat limited data set. But when you look at just the raw mean, the raw differences, what they did was they put people into a single limb control design. So one of your limbs did the higher volume, the other limb did the lower. So you got assigned to doing 6 or 9 sets on your left leg, 15 sets on your right leg. And then after 8 weeks, we look at which one grew more, with you doing low to moderate volume or higher volume. And there were 10 out of the 20 people who actually had slightly higher levels of hypertrophy being on the 6 to 9 sets. So that's half of the people, right, seemed to respond,
Yep.
at least at that time, slightly better to the 6 to 9 sets. Now, many of those were very minor differences between the two groups, but like say, 6 or 7 out of them were pretty substantial when you look at just the kind of the peaks and curves. Now, at the group level, when we take that data and we meta-analyze it, we see a slightly higher mean difference. But that means that, sure, on net average, you're probably gonna make some gains on 10 sets, and it's probably gonna be pretty good, and it's most likely, but with a slightly better probability than doing less or more, gonna be better. But it's certainly open for a lot of individual manipulations over time. So it's just really important anytime I give these general recommendations, for me to say that they really are quite general, and they're not 10 commandments, but they're rather, hey, do you have any training history? Well, in your case, you don't. Okay, well, if I have to play the odds, if I'm going to go to Vegas, I got to gamble, but we have to understand it is a gamble. So we want to try to start, with putting our money on black. We got a 50-50 shot here, just as an analogy, rather than going, let me go play the slots where you've got a very low probability of getting it right. And then from there, we can adjust.
Yeah, that all makes sense. So you've mentioned three main variables here: volume, intensity of load or intensity of effort, and finally frequency. And you've been talking a lot so far about volume in particular, mentioning starting with around 10-ish sets per week and then adjusting based on your own individual variability, essentially. So I'm wondering, since you mentioned volume, that leads me to another question, which is, what is the relationship between volume, intensity, and frequency? Is one more important than the others? How would you start thinking about a program? As in, when you're thinking about these three variables and you're thinking, okay, I've got to have some volume, I've got to have some intensity here, I've got to think about frequency. Where do you start?
Great question. Yeah. So for the goal of hypertrophy specifically, and actually for really any exercise goal, but in a slightly different context, intensity is what actually determines that you are doing the activity at all. So I could do 10 sets of curls with my phone for 10 reps,
True.
but that wouldn't count as anything except me getting a lot of phone calls, right? That just means I'm popular. It won't make my biceps bigger. And if I'm popular and I don't have big biceps, am I really popular? So this becomes
Really, no.
the age-old question, No, but in all seriousness, so that means that we have to have some requisite level of intensity for the sets to quote unquote count.
Mm-hmm.
So they're interrelated. They're intrinsically connected, and they can't be disassembled from one another, even though we try to discuss them in that way. So the reason why I mentioned, hey, it probably needs to be in, like, say, the 6 to 20 rep range for most of your work, is that some data, not all, shows that when you do sets of, say, 2 to 4 compared to sets of 8 to 12, you actually don't see as much hypertrophy when the number of sets are matched. However, there's other data to suggest, okay, well, if I do 4 or 5 sets of 2 to 4, and I compare that to, say, 3 sets of 10, now we're getting a similar change from baseline. So it's like the total volume. And the reason why is that these 3 rep sets, immediately when you start lifting weights, yeah, they're recruiting and training pretty much all your muscle fibers because the load is high enough relative to your maximal effort that to move them efficiently, you need to recruit pretty much everything. However, the set doesn't last long enough to really provide enough of a stimulus. So one way to describe this is a physics terminology we call impulse in biomechanics, which is force times time. So it's the amount of force output, which is how much tension your muscles are exposed to over what time period. So if it was just about, total tension, then we could just do an isometric maximum push against the wall for 1 second. Sweet. That's my push workout. I could pull against the wall, that's my pull workout, and then upper body's done in 20 seconds, So we do see that the body has some temporal awareness of these signals as well. There needs to be some net accumulation. And that's probably why higher levels of volume in kind of a stepwise fashion, to a limit, before it starts to be a little too much, seem to also show higher levels of hypertrophy. So anyway, what is that threshold? Well, in terms of actual load, some studies suggest like really, really low load training is not as efficient at producing hypertrophy. I will note that some of the recent meta-analyses are challenging this finding, but there's enough individual studies where it's a little bit of a head scratcher. And The reason why is a potentially a couple of different factors. It could be that, like I mentioned, it's a little more similar to cardio. So you start to get fatigue or failure or even interference effects that are not related to the simple, straightforward inability to keep producing force at the muscular level. It's also possible that people, because in research we typically have people trained to failure, not always to control for effort,
Mm-hmm.
but identifying failure becomes progressively more challenging as you do more reps. When we've done studies of assessing people's ability to gauge proximity to failure, like how many reps do I have left in the tank, in a 6 rep set, which is heavier by nature, versus a 30 rep set, you're going to see someone who is more accurate in that 6 rep set. If you ask them, between each rep, how many more do you think you could have? If they think they have one more, they're probably pretty close to one more in a set of 6. In a set of 40, they could be off by 5, 6, 7, 8 reps or
Mm-hmm.
more. So if you think back to your own training, dear listener, you can probably think of any time you've done a really high rep set, especially of a compound movement like, say, squats. It's challenging to know, is this just hard, but I can do a lot more? Or is this hard and I'm near failure? Because you're getting this kind of cardiometabolic fatigue, which in the haze of that fatigue, it's challenging to see. So, nonetheless, whether it is an actual mechanistic reason why high rep training in some of these studies doesn't produce the same level of hypertrophy, or it's a logistical problem, if you will, where the fatigue kind of gets in the way, quote unquote, is unknown at this stage. But nonetheless, the most consistent data we have is that you don't want to be really, really heavy, where it limits the number of reps you can get per set, and you don't want to be really, really light, where you're forced to do an astronomical number of reps per set. And the 6 to 20 rep range is a decent recommendation. And it's tied, of course, to proximity to failure, the other aspect of intensity. So you have intensity of load, intensity of effort. As far as effort, we have good data to suggest that you do not need to train to failure. Failure being defined as the moment where you can't maintain the same form and actually complete the concentric phase of the repetition. So if you think about your squat, failure would be getting stuck on the way up. Bicep curl, stuck, and you have to, cheat or use momentum or something like that. However, the exact proximity to failure you need to be to get something equivalent to the same level of stimulus you'd get from training all the way to failure is also murky. And we need more research and more study designs. But a general rule of thumb, when you look at kind of all the studies that get meta-analyzed and they look at failure research, is that
Mm-hmm.
you want to be reasonably close. So what I normally recommend is a like 0 to 4 repetitions in reserve. So you're training, you got 4, maybe sometimes 5 reps in the tank, but probably no more than that. And that's a nice balance between not producing as much fatigue per set, but also making sure that you are training hard enough.
Mm-hmm.
Because the closer you get to failure, the longer we see the recovery time course. You could take a volume match protocol where we train to what we call a 7 RPE, which is, say, 3 reps left in the tank. It's just the inverse of repetitions in reserve. So you're 3 reps from failure versus going to failure. It might take an extra 24 hours before you see your force production get all the way back up to baseline.
Mm-hmm.
And that could, in some cases, depending on the amount of volume you did and your training frequency, impede your ability from training with a high quality. But at the same time, you don't want to take that so far. Like if you're not inducing any fatigue, like I said, now we're back to lifting the phone up. So that's kind of where the sweet spot we think probably is where we're training somewhere between 0 to 4 reps from failure. There's even more nuance than that, though. There are some exercises which expose you to high load when you're in a shortened muscle position. So, for example, like a lateral raise, when your arm's the longest and the lever arm is the furthest distance from the fulcrum, your deltoid's shortened. So even though you go all the way out to failure on a lateral raise, it's unlikely for a trained lifter they're going to be sore the next day, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, for a shoulder press, they might be, because now at the very bottom, when they're a little more stretched, they've got a heavy load. It's very challenging at the bottom of military press. You might get a little soreness in your delts if you did the same number of sets and reps on, say, military press for the next day. And you can see similar parallels in, say, things like lying leg curls versus an RDL, a push-up versus, say, heavy flies, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to pick your spots, for non-technically demanding isolation, machine-based movements where you're trained at, say, a short muscle length. That's kind of one end of the spectrum of, go to town. You go to failure, there's probably not going to produce much fatigue that's going to linger and prevent you from doing your allocated volume at the
Mm-hmm.
allocated frequency. Other side of the spectrum, I'm doing a compound barbell movement where the tension is highest and my muscle length is the longest, say your barbell RDL. And now we're probably going to hold ourselves back, 3-4 reps in reserve and maybe just do more sets to make up for it. And that way we're not going to make it so we can't do a leg workout for the rest of the week. So that's how load interacts with volume.
Yes.
And if you have more additional questions, we could do that, or I can jump right into frequency if you'd like.
I'll just summarize quickly what you said, just to make sure that I understood it and also that the audience is following. So it sounds like volume has a relationship with hypertrophy, and to a point, if you do more volume, you might get more muscle growth. However, not all volume is created equal, and you are using sets to quantify volume, which essentially means that the number of sets you do equals the amount of volume that you're doing. So to make this volume that you're doing effective for hypertrophy, you want your sets to be intense enough in terms of the load that you're lifting, but also how much effort you're putting into each set. And in terms of loads, if you can lift that weight with a proper form for between 6 and about 20 reps, that seems to be enough intensity of load to have enough time under tension for hypertrophy to occur, but also not so much that it becomes difficult to gauge whether the intensity of effort is coming from your cardiovascular system because you're doing 65 reps, or whether it's coming from the muscle fibers actually fatiguing. And then in terms of intensity of effort, you want to use your proximity to failure in terms of how many reps you think you have left in the tank to rate that effort. And you're saying that we don't have enough research to say for sure, but staying at least 4, maybe 5 reps away from failure, and then going from there perhaps a bit higher, closer to failure if the exercise is less demanding, is a good idea, is a good rule of thumb. And then when you consider how close to failure you want to get, you also want to make sure that you can recover from your training. It seems like is what you were saying, because as far as I understand it, if you can't really recover, you're also potentially compromising the adaptation. So different exercises will have different rates of recovery. So when you think about how close to failure do I want to get on an RDL, maybe you stay a bit further away just to make sure that you can recover from it, as opposed to if you're doing a barbell curl, well, okay, let's take it to town because by tomorrow I will barely be sore in my biceps. Would that be a correct summary?
Crushing it. Yeah, you're nailing it in every way. So every time
Awesome.
you say it, I think, man, I could have been way more concise. So
Okay,
yeah.
well, in that case, you can hire me and I'll be your summarizer. You're the science communicator and I write the cliff notes.
I love it. See, I want to get in the cliff notes. I need the little yellow booklets, which are probably PDFs now, and I'm old. So
Sounds
that's
good.
fantastic.
All right, so if that's the relationship between volume and intensity of load and effort, then how does frequency come into it? Can we just do all this volume on one day, boom, we train next week and we'll be fine, we'll grow muscle?
You can, but the suggestion is that maybe you probably wouldn't maximally benefit from it. And this is one where the data has actually bounced around a little bit. We had some meta-analyses that came out in the pre-2017 era. There's one specifically by Schoenfeld in 2016 that suggested, a higher frequency independent of the total amount of work you're doing may enhance hypertrophy. But as we've done more, as science in general, I haven't done a meta-analysis on frequency, so as other people have done meta-analyses on this topic, we've actually found, and it's been repeated by a number of different groups, that it seems like the effect of higher frequencies is actually a volume effect. Because, again, this is just to demonstrate that these are interrelated variables. If you train more frequently, it's more likely that you're doing a higher volume as well in a practical sense. And when you control for the volume, that's when the effect of higher frequency starts to diminish to the point where it's no longer statistically significant. However, what this does tell us, though, not directly, but I would say it's indirect evidence for, is that when you are trying to do higher volumes, higher frequencies can be an excellent tool. So
Mm.
the way I like to present frequency is it's your volume distribution tool. And when we look at research, there are often like 90% of resistance training studies, it's like 2 to 4 times a week. So when we look at frequency research, they have to construct studies where we're either comparing very low to moderate frequency, like most frequency studies are like 3 versus 1, where we train like on a bro split 3 times a week, or we train like a full body split 3 times a week. It's not to say that's all of them, but it is challenging to get not only participants but also your researchers to be in the gym, 5, 6 days a week to really give this a fair shake, and then to have that done enough times where we have a large sample size and we have multiple studies so we can be confident in our conclusions. But nonetheless, right now, with the limited types of designs we've compared to one another, it does seem like for the most part, it is a volume effect when you train with higher frequencies. But that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that we should stick with the bro split, because it's very difficult to get, a lot of productive work done when you're doing 10 plus sets on a given day.
Mhm.
So I think from a logistical and pragmatic perspective, this kind of defaults you to maybe doing at least 2 plus, sessions per muscle group per week as a way to distribute your volume. And at higher levels, for if you happen to have an advanced lifter who benefits from higher volume for a given muscle group, they're doing a specialization cycle or they're doing more work on a given muscle group. That opens up the possibility of doing things like 4 or 5 times per week frequency for that muscle group, but kind of in the context of then everything else is spread out a little differently or has lower volume. So I think in general, the way to conceptualize frequency is it's a tool to preserve the quality of a given workout while still reaching the same target weekly frequency of volume of how many sets you're trying to do in a week. And that's not something we've specifically been able to investigate very effectively.
Mm.
Like, because anytime you're trying to individualize a given program to someone, you have to step away from the scientific research to some degree. Because that's just simply not the way that we do science in most of the designs you see. We use what's called null hypothesis testing, where we are trying to see what is significantly different from something else at the group level. So we have to have a certain amount of people in the study, and we have a p-value of, say, less than 0.05. That means there's less than a 5% chance, if we have a sufficient sample, that these two mean differences were occurring due to chance. So we think it's probably legit. But that tells us something about, on average, for most people in this population, will they respond better to this? But you're not a population, you're a individual. You're one of those data points. And you could be someone, if you look at any study, when you look at the raw data or the individual data, you'll see people who respond away from the group mean, who respond better to a lower or higher dosage of something than the rest of the population, or with something different altogether. So I think it's important to think about frequency just as kind of a slightly separate tool to modulate how your intensity and volume, which are kind of the places that they're not only the stimulus, that they're also the two variables which induce fatigue and require recovery. So you can manipulate how they're dispersed in the week to try to optimize the amount of stimulus relative to fatigue, so that you can have multiple productive weeks in a row of training, not have to deload too frequently, or be able to go into the majority of your workouts as fresh as possible without carrying a ton of muscle damage or mental fatigue or physical fatigue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, when you were designing this hypertrophy program, then what we want to think about is we want to start with probably around 10 sets per muscle group per week. Each set would be ideally within the 6 to 20 rep range, taken to an intensity of effort of about 3 to 4, maybe 5 reps left in the tank. And when we're thinking about how to organize these sets, then that's where frequency come into play, where we might want to aim for a higher frequency, whereby higher, it's more than once a week. Because that way we can make sure that in each session the muscle is recovered enough that the fatigue doesn't prevent us from creating that progressive tension overload that you were talking about in the beginning, so that we can actually get sufficient hypertrophy for the sets that we do. And that might result in us, if we're doing 10 sets rather than doing them all in a single session and hammering your pecs with 10 sets of flies and bench press and whatever else, you might split them into 2 sessions. So you do pecs on Monday and then pecs again on Thursday when you're recovered and no longer extremely sore, and you get potentially a better outcome from splitting the volume that way. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yep, exactly.
Perfect. So if these are the 3, let's call them overarching variables that we want to think about, so volume, intensity, and then frequency, what about some other variables? For example, in terms of exercise selection, there's a lot of noise in the fitness industry about some exercises being necessary in a training program. Now, in terms of if the goal is hypertrophy, is there any exercise that's necessary that we must do to grow muscle?
In a simple sense, no. Ultimately, if we kind of get back to, and I'm glad we started with like the mechanisms, right? If we are producing sufficient mechanical tension in a given muscle, it will grow, you know. So the exercises in a hypertrophy program are essentially just vehicles for that. And there are some great vehicles out there, but you can drive many vehicles to get from point A to point B. And it is easy to fall into, especially with the way the fitness industry is, and you have a lot of different kind of silos of information and almost kind of like a tribal perspective sometimes when people really find something meaningful to them, they find a good community, and they become almost like religious adherents to some approaches sometimes. So you have to be wary. And anytime something looks like a sacred calf and it's on a pedestal, is to just be a little more circumspect. It might be good, but you know, when you hear things like quote unquote squats are king, you know, like king of what? You know, squats are great for squatting, you know. So if you're a power lifter, absolutely you need to be squatting. It's your sport. But maybe you've got you know, a prior back injury, really long femurs, and you know, if you squat regularly, you get a lot of lumbar stress, and you find yourself getting sidelined by a minor ache and pain every, you know, 6 weeks or so. Maybe we should try a leg press. You know, there's no reason why not. So essentially, we want to step away from the idea that there are specific exercises we must do for hypertrophy and think about cardinal movement patterns, which is the way I like to describe them. If we're interested in hypertrophying the majority of the muscles in our body, there's essentially like 6 primary movement patterns that I like to describe. There's your horizontal push, so like a bench press as an example. There's your horizontal pull, so like a row, for example. There's your vertical push and pull, so your overhead press or a chin-up, for example. And then we have our hinge, like a deadlift or an RDL or a good morning. And then we have our squat pattern, which is a very loose definition. When I say squat pattern, I do not mean, you know, barbell squats only. That could be your leg press. That could be your hack squat. That could be your Bulgarian split squat. That could be your front squat or back squat. But it could also be, you know, the Life Fitness, you know, leg press machine. So it's any time you're doing, you know, simultaneous, you know, hip and knee extension, we're talking about a squat pattern there. So if you're doing those 6 movements, you've got the majority of your bases covered, and then you just need to sprinkle in some isolation movements to kind of cover some of the things that aren't effectively trained in those compound exercises. You know, your bicep curl, your tricep push down, your calf raise, your leg curl, your leg extension, some rear delt work, lateral raises, etc. But yeah, those categories should probably be a part of most people's exercise protocols. And then you just need to figure out which you prefer, what suits your injury history, your limb lengths, your biomechanics, and your expertise level. You know, maybe you don't jump right into doing a bunch of free weight barbell movements, but you start with some machines as you're learning the ropes if you're new to lifting, and then, you know, you wait until you hire a, you know, personal trainer, or you've, you know, gotten a course or something like that before you jump into some of the more complex movements. But generally, that's kind of the way I view exercise selection.
That makes sense. So if you can essentially choose from any exercise that falls within these six cardinal movement patterns. What about exercise variation? How important is it? Because you will hear some people claim that we need to confuse the muscles and change exercises very often to optimally grow, whereas other people would never change their exercise program and they would keep doing 3 by 10 on the bench press for the rest of their lives. So what in your opinion is a better approach, if there is one?
Yeah, there is, and as you will often find, there's truth to both kind of camps, if you will, on the extremes, and somewhere that is probably a happy medium, which where things are a little bit better than either one of the extremes. So, interestingly enough, we do have data showing that having more exercise variety does induce slightly more homogeneous hypertrophy. And this comes from the fact that the body is quite complex, you know. So the reason why squats probably aren't king for hypertrophy, although they're very good, but I wouldn't describe them as king or the one movement you need, or like this will take care of all your quad growth, is because the act of knee extension is complex. You know, the biomechanics of the squat are such that because you're doing simultaneous hip extension and knee extension, that means that something like knee flexion or hip flexion would actually oppose those two movements of hip extension and knee extension. Interestingly enough, the quadriceps four muscles, one of them, the rectus femoris, is also a hip flexor. So it crosses not only the knee joint, but the hip joint. So it acts as either a knee extensor or a hip flexor, which means while you're trying to extend your hip with your glutes, it's actually going to be relatively quiescent. And we see poor rectus femoris growth in studies on squats. So the rec fem, the kind of the middle head of your quadricep, that doesn't grow very well if you were to just do squats. And for the same reason, your hamstrings are actually not doing that much in a squat either, because while they're trying to flex the knee, they would be opposing the quads that are trying to extend the knee. So really, squats are generally considered quad and glute exercises, you know, if you're squatting deep enough. So if you were to just do squats and think that's all I need from my lower body, and if you had a surface level understanding of anatomy and physiology, where you go, well, you know, you are doing hip extension in a squat, and the hamstrings are a synergist with the glutes for hip extension. That's true, but not when you're also trying to do knee extension. So this is one of those things where the level of depth you need to get with the evidence, if you will, or the principles, is a little deeper to make sure that you're really covering your bases. And you know, for a general trainee, someone who just wants to have overall fitness and hypertrophy, I wouldn't even get this deep. But if someone who's like, yeah, I want to be as muscular as possible in all muscle groups, I'd say, well, then this is why we need to have some other movements in there. And there's parallels to that in a lot of different aspects of the body. You know, I just to give a few more examples, one of the heads of the hamstrings is only a knee flexor. So we probably can't just do a hinge. We might need to isolate it and actually do some knee flexion. As another example, the long head of the triceps is not just an elbow extensor, but it's also a shoulder extensor. So it's probably not doing a whole lot on pressing, which requires shoulder flexion, like your overhead press or your bench press. So you think, you know, benches for chest and tris, it's like chest and 2/3 of your tris, you know. So those type of things require us to do some isolation movements and to think about some of these aspects. And if you want to take it even a step further, we've also got a lot of recent research that suggests when you're training a muscle through a full range of motion, that's great, but primarily because you're training it in a lengthened position. So for example, a lateral raise with a dumbbell where the weight is in line with gravity when it's at your side, when the delts are in a slightly more stretched position, and it gets progressively heavier and the tension increases as you get into a shortened position, that might be worse than, say, doing a lateral raise with a cable where there's immediate tension throughout the full range when your muscle is in that slightly more stretched position, right? So again, that's just an example, and I don't want to just throw a whole bunch of complexity on this, but the point being is that there's a reason why bodybuilders have historically had a little more variety, and they've come up with principles like the muscle confusion theory. It's probably because of observations that if you just rigidly stick to a few muscle groups, you don't get as quite as proportionate development. Stick to a few exercises, you don't get quite as proportionate development across muscle groups. And the data has borne that out. When we look at studies where there's higher versus lower exercise variety, but still in a systematic way, not with randomization, then we actually see superior hypertrophy. And we actually do randomization, you can get into these issues where you randomly manage to miss some of these exercises and you don't get better hypertrophy. So while I don't think muscle confusion is a good idea, because then you're haphazardly switching exercises, having a certain understanding of functional anatomy so that you can have a robust selection of exercises and an appropriate amount of variety is important. And there's a difference between variety and variation. And that's where the muscle confusion folks kind of conflate the two. It's like, oh, well, I just need to change things all the time. And that
Yes.
probably isn't true. So the person who's doing their 3x10 probably has that right. Is, once you have your library of exercises per se, and you set them up for a program, you can probably stick with that for multiple months, just until you plateau, or you get a little niggle in your elbow, or you just get bored of those movements. You can feel free to swap things out. And we have data to suggest it's not a big deal when you're swapping out, especially low complexity exercises like isolation movements. So you can have higher variety, but at the same time, you also need to become someone who is skilled at these movements. So we have data showing, for example, there's a study on untrained women where they trained for 20 weeks, and they assessed their biceps, trunk, and quadriceps hypertrophy at the 0, 10, and 20-week mark. And they were
Mm.
doing bench press, leg press, and bicep curls. And interestingly enough, at the 10-week mark, the only group that had grown, this is the midpoint of the study of the muscles, was their biceps. However, they didn't see trunk or quadricep growth that would have been coming from these compound movements. That was delayed until the 20th week, meaning that for a simple isolation movement like the biceps curl, it took less time to become neuromuscularly efficient and learn that movement pattern to where you could actually induce hypertrophy. While on the leg press and the bench press, it took more time before those gains in strength, which were observed, were actually sufficient enough to produce enough of a stimulus to actually hypertrophy, say, the pecs and the quadriceps. So if you were to constantly switch things out, especially when you start out as a novice, and every time you get in the gym, you're doing a different chest press or a different squat pattern, you might actually delay growth. So yeah, that's the Captain 3x10 in your example. He's not going to have that problem, but at the same time, he might be neglecting, say, his clavicular head of his pectoralis major. He's only doing flat press because we have some data showing like some incline pressing could actually help grow that head of the pec. So yeah, I think two principles here is that you want a decent variety of exercises to cover your bases based upon the complexity
Hmm.
of human anatomy. And then as far as how often do you vary them, not so often that you don't actually get to develop skill with especially the compound complex free weight multi-joint movements. But also don't feel like you can never change them, especially for things that have a very low skill level or low complexity, like isolation movements and the like.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining all of that. And in fact, thank you for covering all of the ground that we've covered so far in the interview. I want to be really respectful of your time. So I think for today, as I said, we've covered a lot, and there are a lot of important and valuable takeaways that all the listeners can take home with them and use to start designing their own training programs for hypertrophy. Now, before I let you go, is there anything that you want to say in closing, and also obviously share where people can find you and plug anything that you are excited to plug at this moment?
Sure, man. Well, first, let me just say thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I think you do a great job summarizing and asking questions that are very useful. And I hope the listeners gotten some good takeaways. One thing to keep in mind to the listener is when we're providing these kind of specific recommendations and spectrums and do's and don'ts and continuum of ranges, is to remember that while they sound quite specific, they're all pretty broad. Saying, hey, do 10 sets, but maybe less, maybe more, depending on your mileage, across at least, maybe 2 sessions per week. And, choose a lot of different exercises in these 6 movement patterns. That's a lot of actual room to play with, and most importantly is you should be setting up programs that you enjoy the shit out of. So it should be fun. And if it's not fun, you won't put in maximal effort, you won't stick with it, and you won't grow anyway. So I will say that one overriding principle for everything I've said is feel free to color outside of the lines a little bit if it enhances enjoyment, because that will ultimately enhance all the outcomes that come from training. So that's the only additive piece of information. And as far as where people can find me, probably the best one-stop shop would be 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. And from there, you can find links to Mass, my books, podcasts, articles. And the only other place to listen would be the Iron Culture podcast, where Omar and I talk about all things related to lifting. And then you can follow me at Helms3DMJ on Instagram for me linking out what's kind of been going on in more recent times.
And obviously, I will have all of these links in the show notes just to make it public. I read all of your books. I am subscribed to Mass. When I was a student at university, I came across Mass, and I looked into the lifetime membership, and I was like, hey, I have savings. Dump them on the lifetime membership, so you'll never get rid of me as a subscriber. And I have learned a lot from you and your work. So I think that if the listeners check out any of the resources that you just provided, they are going to get a lot more of the details that we had to leave out of an hour-long interview. So if they want to dig into anything that we discussed today, definitely read Eric's books, follow him on Instagram, listen to the Iron Culture podcast, which is incredible and very enjoyable, especially if you like a good bit of banter as well as knowledge. So, Eric, again, thank you very much for coming on. And listeners, I'll chat to you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode. I really hope that you liked it. I loved talking to Eric. Eric was the first evidence-based practitioner in the fitness space that I encountered when I got into bodybuilding. His 2 books, the Muscle and Strength Pyramids for Training and Nutrition, are the first 2 evidence-based fitness books that I ever purchased. And that's how I got my feet wet and learned more about bodybuilding, hypertrophy, and effective training and nutrition practices to build muscle and lose body fat. And this was about a year before I became qualified as a personal trainer. So I 100% guarantee that you will not regret getting his books and visiting the 3D Muscle Journey website to check out his articles, videos, and podcasts. As always, you'll also find a link to my website and my Instagram account in the show notes alongside Eric's own links. And if you want to apply to work with me, I'm currently taking on one-on-one online coaching clients. So all you need to do is follow the link to my website, fill out the application that you'll find there, and then we'll set up a complimentary consultation that will take place via video where we can discuss your goals. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.